Steve Johnson was Kawasaki's own test rider. His job was to evaluate prototypes before they went into production. Here is what he said about riding the H2 Mach IV for the first time. He said, "High-speed stability was unacceptable. I just sorta hung on and prayed. Kawasaki heard that feedback. They noted it. Then they put the bike into production anyway. 74 horsepower, a frame that flexed at speed, 2 steering dampers bolted on from the factory because one could not control the wobble. They called it the Widowmaker. Not the press, not the riders. Kawasaki's own people gave it that name. And for $1,386, anyone who could reach the foot pegs could take one home." This is the story of the most dangerous, mass-produced motorcycle of the 1970s, and whether the legend matches the evidence. The Kawasaki H2 Mach IV was a 750 cubic centimeter two-stroke triple that made 74 horsepower. That might not sound impressive today when a base model sport bike makes twice that, but in 1972, nothing on two wheels came close. The H2's power-to-weight ratio was the best of any production motorcycle on Earth, 1 horsepower for every 5.7 pounds of machine. And it delivered all that power in a way that actively tried to kill you. The front wheel came up in first gear, sometimes second, sometimes third. The frame flexed so badly at speed that riders called it the Flexi Flyer. The brakes could stop you once maybe, but not twice in a row. And the engine had a personality disorder. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, it was docile, almost sluggish. Then somewhere around 5,000 revolutions per minute, the expansion chambers caught the exhaust pulses just right, and the bike surged forward like it had been rear-ended by a pickup truck. One contemporary reviewer described it this way: "The Kawasaki engine rockets to 7,500 revolutions per minute at the touch of the throttle. Nick it, and it comes at your throat with a cacophony of ringing fins and slapping pistons and horsepower unrestrained." That was Cycle magazine. They meant it as a compliment. So here is the question that brought me down this rabbit hole. How dangerous was the H2 actually? Because I kept finding two completely different stories. One version says it was a genuine death machine, a motorcycle so lethal that insurance companies refused to cover it, and emergency rooms knew it by name. The other version says the Widowmaker reputation is overblown, that the H2 was no worse than other fast bikes of its era, and the legend grew in the retelling. Both versions cite the same bike, both claim to have evidence. So I went looking for the truth, and what I found was more interesting than either story. To understand why the H2 existed at all, you need to understand how desperate Kawasaki was in the 1960s. Picture the American motorcycle market in 1967. Honda dominated. They had the CB750 in development, a sophisticated 4-cylinder, 4-stroke that would revolutionize the industry. Yamaha and Suzuki were established players. And then there was Kawasaki, the smallest and newest of Japan's Big Four, scrambling for market share with a lineup of forgettable small displacement bikes. Kawasaki could not out-engineer Honda. They did not have the resources or the expertise, so they chose a different weapon, raw, unfiltered 2-stroke power. In 1967, Kawasaki launched a secret program called Project N100. The goal seemed impossible. Build a 500 cubic centimeter engine that made 60 horsepower, capable of running the quarter mile in under 13 seconds. At the time, no production motorcycle had ever broken 13 seconds. The result was the H1 Mach III, and it changed everything. When the H1 debuted in September 1968, Kawasaki's test rider Tony Nicosia took an uncrated 0-mile machine to Lyons drag strip and ran a 12.96-second quarter mile at 100.7 miles per hour. It was the first production motorcycle to break 13 seconds, and it cost just $999, which was remarkably affordable. The H1 was a commercial sensation. It put Kawasaki on the performance map overnight. It was also, by all accounts, a handful. One journalist described its handling characteristics as acceptable only when the bike was stopped with the engine switched off. The nickname Widowmaker was actually coined for the H1 first by Kawasaki's own people. Tony Nicosia, now 84 years old, explained in a recent interview that he and Paul Collins, Kawasaki's advertising manager, started using the term because of the way it might flip over backwards and spit you on the ground or get a wobble at high speed. That the Widowmaker label was born inside Kawasaki itself matters. Then Honda dropped the CB7504 in 1969 and established 750 cubic centimeters as the new benchmark. Suzuki answered with their liquid-cooled GT 750. Kawasaki's four-stroke Z1 was still years from production. The only way to compete immediately was to build a bigger two-stroke. The H2 was not simply a bored-out H1. It was an entirely new 748 cubic centimeter engine with 3 air-cooled cylinders and an over-square bore and stroke. It was fed by 330mm Mikuni slide carburetors and fired by a capacitor discharge ignition system with an individual trigger, amplifier, and coil for each cylinder. The crankshaft used 120-degree firing intervals across 6 main bearings. The factory claim was 74 horsepower at 6,800 revolutions per minute and 57 pound-feet of torque at 6,500 revolutions per minute. In Cycle Magazine's landmark 1973 Superbike shootout, pitting the H2 against the Honda CB750, Kawasaki's own Z1, the Norton Commando, the Triumph Trident, the Ducati 750 GT, and the Harley-Davidson Sportster, the H2 produced the highest dynamometer horsepower and torque readings of all 7 motorcycles. It was not even close. Now here is the single most important technical concept for understanding why the H2 earned its reputation. If you do not understand two-stroke power bands, the rest of this story will not make sense. The two-stroke engine is fundamentally different from a four-stroke. Two-strokes rely on tuned exhaust expansion chambers and precise port timing to generate power. At specific revolutions per minute, exhaust pulses create pressure waves that dramatically increase how much fuel and air mixture enters the cylinders. Below that range, the expansion chambers are essentially inert. The result is an on-off power delivery, virtually nothing, then everything, with almost no transition. The H2's piston port design made this even more pronounced. Unlike later two-strokes with reed valves or disc valves, or modern engines with electronically controlled exhaust power valves, the H2 had no mechanism to smooth the power curve. Below roughly 4,000 revolutions per minute, the engine was docile. Cycle World noted in 1975 an enormous amount of surge at lower speeds. The large ports simply could not flow properly at small throttle openings or low revs, making the bike buck and hesitate in traffic. Then somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 revolutions per minute, the expansion chambers began to work. One period description captures it perfectly. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, it was relatively tame, but once the attach needle swung past that mark, the bike surged forward like it had been rear-ended by a pickup. At 6,000 revolutions per minute, according to Ultimate Motorcycling, it went shrieking crazy. And here is the critical detail. Peak torque arrived at 6,500 revolutions per minute. Peak horsepower arrived at 6,800 revolutions per minute. That is just 300 revolutions per minute between them. The H2 made almost no power, then suddenly made all of its power, and the torque peak and horsepower peak arrived at almost exactly the same moment. One technical retrospective called it a massive hit when they sing together. The consequences were predictable. Unintentional wheelies were constant. The front wheel lifted easily in first and second gear, sometimes third. A poorly timed throttle roll on mid-corner could instantly break rear tire traction. A downshift that dropped the engine into the power band caught riders going from mild to wild with no warning. And at precisely 6,000 revolutions per minute, the threshold where peak power was building, handlebar vibration became so severe that Cycle World reported it was difficult to hang on very long. The rider was simultaneously fighting a power surge, a vibrating chassis, and a lightning front end. One commenter's account from a vintage motorcycle forum stands out. "I rode one once. Scared the daylights out of me. Screaming along over 100 and I looked down. Front wheel was off the ground. But power alone does not make a motorcycle dangerous. Plenty of powerful bikes are perfectly manageable." What made the H2 lethal was the combination of that power with a chassis that was never designed to handle it. The H2's tubular steel double cradle frame was essentially a slightly reinforced version of the 500 cubic centimeter H1's chassis. Larger diameter tubes, one extra diagonal brace between the swing arm pivot and top tube. That was it. For 74 horsepower from a peaky two-stroke, this was grossly inadequate. Under hard cornering or at speeds above 100 miles per hour, the frame flexed laterally. Bennett's Insurance described it bluntly. The H2's lightweight tubular cradle frame was simply incapable of containing the vicious performance of the motor. It flexed under cornering, and it weaved horribly on uneven roads. Riders nicknamed it the Flexi Flyer. One owner recalled it feeling like a rubber frame. The steering geometry compounded the problem. Cycle World noted the fork angle was a steep 26.5 degrees. We would expect this steering geometry on a short tracker weighing several hundred pounds less. The original 1972 model had a 55.5-inch wheelbase, which was short for the power output. The engine was placed rearward to maximize rear-wheel traction for drag strip launches. This made the bike rear-heavy under acceleration, but oddly front-heavy at rest, and critically it meant the front wheel had almost no authority under power. Perhaps the most telling engineering detail is this. Kawasaki fitted the H2 with two steering dampers from the factory, one friction type and one hydraulic. No other production motorcycle of the era required this. Think about that. The engineers who built this machine knew the chassis had a stability problem they could not fully resolve, so they bolted on two devices to dampen the oscillations and shipped it anyway. The suspension completed the dysfunction. Non-adjustable 36mm telescopic front forks were too stiff for small bumps, but insufficient for hard cornering. The rear twin shocks had only 3-position preload adjustment and no damping control. Cycle World magazine's 1975 assessment was damning. They suffered from a lack of travel, stiff springs, and poor damping control. When the G-forces from cornering or bumps in the road bottom the rear shocks, the bike wiggles. Go any faster, or hit a bump that is just a little larger, and you are not only going to have your hands full, but there is an excellent possibility you will experience gravel rash firsthand. The braking system presents a surprising paradox. A single 295mm front disc paired with a drum rear sounds inadequate, and subjectively it felt inadequate. But in Cycle Magazine's 1973 comparison, the H2 recorded the highest braking G-force of all 7 bikes tested, 0.922 G. The problem was brake fade under repeated hard stops, and the fact that a single disc, while adequate for one panic stop, could not safely manage the demands of a bike capable of 120+ miles per hour. A second front disc was available as a factory option, with mounting lugs pre-installed on the right fork leg. It was another quiet acknowledgement from Kawasaki that they knew the standard brakes were not enough. So let's talk about the name itself. Where did Widowmaker actually come from? I mentioned earlier that Tony Nicosia, Kawasaki's legendary test rider and drag racing champion, claims the term was used inside Kawasaki during the 1970s, first for the H1 and then for the larger H2. He and Paul Collins, the advertising manager, coined it as a dark joke about the H1's tendency to flip over backwards or get into high-speed wobbles. This is significant because some debunkers claim the Widowmaker label was applied retroactively, invented by the internet to make the bike sound more dramatic than it was. The evidence suggests otherwise. The nickname originated with the people who built and sold the motorcycle. Once word got round about what a beast the H2 was, two things happened. Insurance companies refused to quote for them, and biker interest went through the roof. If you were half a man or a full-on loony, you had to have an H2. That quote comes from Classic Motorcycle Mechanics magazine, and it captures the feedback loop that defined the H2's reputation. The danger was part of the appeal. Young men bought the H2 specifically because it was scary. Insurance refusals are consistently reported across multiple independent sources. I need to be transparent here. Despite extensive searching, I could not locate specific actuarial data, premium figures, or named insurer documents from the 1970s confirming this. The claim should be treated as widely accepted, but not independently verified, with primary insurance industry documentation. This matters because of what we are about to discuss. Here is where the investigation gets complicated. What did the motorcycle press actually say about the H2 when it was new? If you only know the Widowmaker legend, you might expect uniformly terrified reviews. That's not what the record shows. The earliest period reviews were more positive than the myth implies. Motorcyclist magazine's January 1972 test of the brand new H2 declared that handling is far better than expected and a vast improvement over the sometimes snaky Mach IV. Thankfully, the geometry and suspension of the 750 are up to the job. Up to the job is not the language of a death machine. Cycle News editor Art Friedman tested the H2 as a touring bike in May 1972 and concluded that the Kawasaki 750 then is a very pleasant, manageable machine that, because of its incredible performance, has been burdened with the wrong image. He later added that it handled well and had good brakes, even when ridden hard in the twisties. Pleasant, manageable, wrong image. These are professional motorcycle journalists in 1972, and they are defending the H2's reputation. The Cycle Magazine 1973 Superbike Shootout is the most comprehensive contemporary comparison we have. 7 bikes, head-to-head, tested by the same team on the same roads and track. Despite everything written about the H2's ill handling, frame flexing, and supposed tendency to speed wobble, the H2 tied the Kawasaki Z1 for the fastest road course lap time. Same lap time as Kawasaki's sophisticated 4-stroke flagship. Cycle called it the quickest, most intense, most single-purpose street machine ever built for general consumption. A streaming, purple-eyed monster that does everything with a shriek, and whose only god is performance. The H2 won the overall comparison on points. It beat the Honda CB750. It beat the Norton Commando. It beat the Triumph Trident. It beat the Ducati. It beat the Harley. And it tied the Z1 that was supposed to make it obsolete. So where does the Widowmaker reputation come from, if the contemporary reviews were this positive? The critical turn came with Cycle World's devastating March 1975 farewell review titled Evil, Wicked, Mean, and Nasty. By 1975, the Z1 had been on the market for 2 years. Standards had changed. Riders now knew what a fast motorcycle could handle like. And the H2, even in its improved final year H2C form, was obsolete. Cycle World concluded without a doubt that Kawasaki's awesome 750 Triple is a bike that has outlived its usefulness. It was conceived at a time when the buying public was preoccupied with acceleration, gut-grabbing acceleration, and little else. Cycle World acknowledged that the improved swing arm had turned the original model's deadly wobble into an acceptable wiggle. But they concluded the bike was conceived a brute and, in spite of several improvements, has remained a brute to this day. The Widowmaker reputation grew darker as standards rose. The 1972 H2 was genuinely dangerous, but reviewers graded it on a 1972 curve when all big motorcycles had flex-prone frames and bias-ply tires. By 1975, the Z1 had shown what was possible, and the H2 looked like a relic from a more reckless age. The truth sits between the myth and the debunking. The H2 was dangerous enough to terrify professional test riders and earn 2 factory steering dampers. But it was also ridden daily by thousands of owners who survived just fine. Now let's address the elephant in the room. How many people actually died on the H2? If you search online, you will find a figure, 127 fatal crashes. That number appears on several websites, sometimes with additional detail claiming that 89% of these fatalities occurred during overtaking maneuvers. That number is almost certainly fabricated. The source appears to be a low-quality, likely AI-generated article on an e-bike website. No motorcycle safety organization is named. No other source corroborates the figure. The suspicious specificity, 89% during overtaking, is a hallmark of AI hallucination, the kind of detail a language model invents to sound authoritative. Here is the reality. No government agency tracked model-specific motorcycle fatalities in the early 1970s. The NHTSA database does not contain records from this era for this specific model. The landmark Hurt Report on motorcycle crash causation was not published until 1981. In 1972, there were virtually no federal standards governing motorcycle frame rigidity, suspension quality, braking adequacy, or stability. We simply do not know how many people died on the H2. Anyone who claims otherwise is either misinformed or lying. What does exist is a deep and consistent well of evidence. Cook Nielsen, editor of Cycle magazine, recounted riding the H2 on a favorite test road in the Santa Monica Mountains and said it nearly killed him when he ran off the road and ended up in a fence. Steve Johnson, Kawasaki's test rider, described riding the prototype and said high-speed stability was unacceptable and that he just sort of hung on and prayed. Owner after owner, across forums spanning decades, describes the same litany: uncontrollable wheelies, high-speed wobbles that felt like riding a shark, passengers thrown off the back under hard acceleration, and the omnipresent fear of the power band catching you unaware. The engineering case for danger is ironclad: a 74 horsepower, two-stroke triple with a light switch power band, a flex-prone frame, inadequate suspension, bias ply tires, and a single front disc brake was an objectively hazardous combination. This is confirmed by Kawasaki's test rider testimony, by the factory installation of dual steering dampers, and by progressive detuning across model years. We do not need a body count to know the H2 was dangerous. The evidence is in the machine itself. Kawasaki's response to the H2's reputation played out in real-time engineering changes across its 4 production years. The 1974 H2B received a 2-inch longer swing arm, extending the wheelbase from 55.5 to roughly 57 inches. They detuned the engine from 74 to 71 horsepower, and they repositioned the steering damper. The 1975 H2C stretched the wheelbase further to 57.5 inches and continued softening the power delivery. A British motorcycle tester assessing the supposedly tamed 1974 model offered the immortal verdict that they might as well have been giving Tyrannosaurus Rex a shot of underarm deodorant and a flea collar. Multiple forces killed the H2 after 1975. The 1973 Arab oil embargo tripled fuel prices. That was devastating for a motorcycle that Cycle World said uses as much gas as a compact car, dipping below 20 miles per gallon when ridden hard. EPA motorcycle emission standards arrived in 1978. 2-strokes inherently produce far more unburned hydrocarbons than 4-strokes. The writing was on the wall. Kawasaki's own Z1, producing 82 horsepower from a silky double overhead cam inline 4, made the H2 redundant. Why sell a dangerous, thirsty, polluting 2-stroke when you could sell a faster, smoother, more sophisticated 4-stroke? Cycle magazine wrote in 1974 that the Mach IV made us turn toward a more balanced kind of performance, and thus assured the future of machines like the exquisitely contrived Kawasaki Z1. But in doing that, we may have moved where the big 2-stroke triple cannot follow. The H2's production ended in 1975. Approximately 47,000 units were built across all model years. The H2's influence on motorcycle design was profound and direct. Sam Tanegashima, a member of the Z1 development team, recalled that before the Z1 Kawasaki had developed several very fast motorcycles like the A7, H1, and H2. It was not sure if we were selling engine or horsepower or motorcycle. From the very beginning of Z1 development, we made sure to develop one piece of motorcycle, not independent engine or chassis designing. That single statement captures the lesson the H2 taught the entire industry. A motorcycle is more than an engine bolted to a frame. Power without control is not performance, it's just violence. Today, the H2's collector value has soared. Average examples sell for $20,000 to $25,000. A 1972 model reached $55,000 at Mecum's January 2024 Las Vegas auction, the highest price ever paid for an H2 at public auction. The H2 now outsells the legendary Z1 at auction by an average of $2,000 or more per bike. At that same Mecum auction, the top 8 Kawasaki 2-stroke triple prices were all paid by the same anonymous internet bidder, suggesting a serious collector is assembling a definitive collection. Clean original survivors grow scarcer each year. Kawasaki itself has never forgotten. The modern Ninja H2, a supercharged 4-stroke hyperbike, deliberately borrows the H2 designation, trading on the mystique of the original. The company that once was not sure if it was selling engine or horsepower or motorcycle now builds some of the most sophisticated machines on 2 wheels. The Widowmaker was the crucible that forged that transformation. So let me bring this back to the question I started with. How dangerous was the Kawasaki H2 Mach IV, actually? The engineering case is closed. A 74 horsepower two-stroke with a light switch power band, a frame built for half that power, inadequate suspension, primitive brakes, and 1970s tire technology was an objectively dangerous combination. This is confirmed by test rider testimony, factory design compromises, and progressive engineering changes across model years. The Widowmaker nickname was real. It was coined inside Kawasaki by employees who rode the prototype and knew what they were selling. But the specific death toll claims are fabricated. No verified statistics exist. The 127 figure is internet mythology, probably generated by an AI that had never heard of the Hurt report. The most interesting finding is the gap between the legend and the contemporary record. Reviewers in 1972 praised the H2's handling relative to its predecessor. Professional journalists wrote it across the country and called it pleasant. The Widowmaker reputation crystallized later, as rising standards recontextualized what had been merely exciting as genuinely dangerous. The H2 was both things at once. Some professional journalists crashed theirs into fences. Others rode them coast to coast in comfort. It was a machine that terrified Kawasaki's own test rider, and it also won its class in the most comprehensive magazine comparison of the era. Its legacy is not simply as a death machine, it is the motorcycle that taught an entire industry, starting with Kawasaki itself, that power without control is not performance, it is just violence. And maybe that is why, 50 years later, collectors are paying $55,000 for the privilege of owning a piece of that violence. Not to ride it, not anymore. Just to look at the purple paint and the 3 exhaust pipes, and remember a time when a motorcycle company would build something this unhinged, slap a $1,386 price tag on it, and let anyone who could reach the foot pegs take it home. That era is gone. The Widowmaker made sure of it. If you found this investigation as fascinating as I did, check out the video on screen right now. It covers another engineering disaster that changed an entire industry. If you want more deep dives into the machines and mistakes that shaped the world, subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. I'll see you in the next one.